On the night of November 12, 1967, a North Vietnamese officer named Thanh lay on a ridge in the Central Highlands and waited for a company of Americans to do the sensible thing. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered 5 to 1. Their radio antennas had been shot away, and by every sign Thanh could read, their officers were dead or dying. In Than's experience, a unit in that condition did one of two things. It broke and ran, or it went to ground and waited to be finished. Either way, the ending was the same. He had been fighting Americans for 2 years. He respected their machines and feared their aircraft, but he did not think they were hard men, and he had built his whole plan on that belief. The Americans on that hilltop did not try to save themselves. Thanh watched, and he could not believe what he was seeing. They did not go to ground. They did not wait. A handful of riflemen, Thanh could not know that one of them was a corporal named Ray Doyle, 19, from a coal town in West Virginia, got up out of their holes in the dark and attacked. They came off that hilltop and straight into the guns that were closing on them. Not to escape. There was no escape in that direction. They came down the hill to get to their wounded who had fallen forward in front of the line. Than's men, who had them beaten, who outnumbered them 5 to 1, broke first. For a few terrible minutes, men who had every advantage found themselves being driven backward by men who had none. And Thanh, watching it, understood that his whole model of this enemy was wrong. He had thought these Americans would fight hardest when they had the most to lose. Instead, they fought hardest when they had, by every measure he understood, nothing left to lose at all. By the end of that war, Thanh would come to understand what he was really looking at that night. It was not recklessness. It was not that these men did not fear death. It was something else, something he had misread from the very first, and it would take him years to see it clearly. American riflemen, at their most dangerous, did not fight like men with nothing to lose. They fought like men with everything to lose. And everything they had to lose was lying in the mud in front of them, and they were coming to get it back. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why one enemy officer had to throw out everything he thought he knew, you first have to understand what he expected. And you have to understand why the men on that hilltop did the exact opposite. Every army fights according to a picture in its head, a picture of how the enemy will behave, what he fears, when he will break. Get the picture right, and you can plan a battle before it happens. Get it wrong, and no plan survives the first contact. The North Vietnamese Army had a very good picture of the American soldier, and for the most part it served them well. But there was one piece of it that was wrong, and that one wrong piece cost them dearly again and again for the length of the war. Here is the picture the NVA carried into battle. The American was rich, well-fed, and well-equipped. He fought from a distance when he could. He leaned on his artillery and his aircraft and his helicopters because those were his real strength. Take those away, cut him off, get in close where the big guns could not reach without hitting their own, and you stripped him down to just a man. And the man, the NVA believed, was the weak part. He did not want to be in that jungle. He was counting the days until he went home. He would fight when he had to, but he would not throw his life away. Given the choice between a hopeless fight and staying alive, he would choose to stay alive. Any sensible man would. Most of that picture was true. The Americans did lean on their firepower. Many of them were counting the days, and a great many of them, in a hopeless spot, did the sensible thing. But the NVA had drawn one wrong conclusion from all of it. They had assumed that because the American loved his life, he could be counted on to protect it. They assumed that a surrounded American unit, once its situation became hopeless, would behave the way surrounded men are supposed to behave. It would hunker down. It would wait for rescue. And if rescue did not come, It would, eventually, give up. Captain Thon believed this as firmly as any officer in his army, and he was not a fool for believing it. He was a careful, intelligent man who had survived years of a war that killed the careless quickly. He had fought the French before the Americans, and he had learned his trade in a hard school. He had earned his caution. As a young man, he had carried ammunition up the ridges at Dien Bien Phu, and he had watched a Western army that everyone called superior come apart under siege. That victory had taught him a lesson he carried for the rest of his life, that no enemy is unbeatable, that every army has a place where it breaks, and that the whole art of war is finding that place and putting your weight on it. He had found the breaking place in the French. He had found it in the first Americans he fought, the ones who leaned too hard on their firepower and folded when it was taken away. He had no reason to think this enemy would be any different. Every enemy he had ever faced had a breaking place. He simply had to find this one's. His plan for that hilltop in November was a good plan. Surround the company, cut its communications, kill its leaders, then squeeze through the night until the thing came apart on its own. It was exactly the right plan for the enemy he thought he was facing. The trouble was that he was not facing that enemy. He was facing something his picture had no room for. And the strangest part, the part Thon would puzzle over for the rest of his life, was that the men who ruined his plan were not special men. They were not commandos. They were not fanatics. They were ordinary draftees and volunteers, tired and frightened and homesick, exactly the soft young men his picture described. And they fought like the picture was a lie. Understanding how those two things could both be true is the whole of this story. It was not the first time American riflemen had done this. It was only the first time Thon had watched it happen with his own eyes, close enough to feel it. And what he felt that night was something no plan had prepared him for. The fight for the hilltop had gone exactly to his design for the first 2 hours. His regiment had come up through the dark in 3 prongs and closed the ring. The American company was caught on high ground that was too small to hold and too exposed to leave. Thon's mortars found them. His machine guns found the gaps. The American radios went silent one by one as the antennas came down. He watched their fire slacken as their ammunition thinned and their leaders fell. By the darkest hour of the night, everything was proceeding the way it was supposed to. The thing on the hilltop was dying, and Thon had only to keep the pressure on until morning. From the ridge, Thon could read the battle by its sound. He had learned to do that over the years, to hear a unit dying without ever seeing it. The American fire had a particular thinness now, the ragged sound of men rationing rounds they could not replace. Between the bursts, he could hear other things, shouted names, a voice calling for a medic again and then not again. The flat crump of his own mortars walking across the high ground. To his trained ear, it was the sound of a company coming to its end. He had heard it many times before, and he knew how it finished. He was wrong about how this one would finish, but he did not know that yet, and for 1 more hour he sat on his ridge and listened to what he was certain was a victory. Then a group of the Americans came off the hill. Not in retreat. Retreat would have made sense, and Thon had troops positioned to catch a retreat. They came the other way. They came down the forward slope toward the tightening ring, toward the heaviest of his guns. For a moment, Thon thought it was a mistake, a panicked rush by men who had lost their heads. Then he saw what they were doing. There were wounded Americans out there, men who had been hit and had fallen forward down the slope into the ground between the two forces. And these riflemen had left their cover in the dark into the teeth of the guns to bring those men back. Understand what a strange and terrible thing that was to witness. By every rule of war, Thon knew those wounded men were already lost. You do not trade living soldiers for dying ones. A sound commander writes off the men he cannot reach and saves the men he can. That is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. and war runs on arithmetic. But the Americans coming down that slope were not doing arithmetic. They were doing something else, something that did not fit on Thon's ledger at all. And because it did not fit, he could not predict it. And because he could not predict it, he could not stop it. His forward soldiers, the ones who took the charge, broke. This is the part Thon could never fully explain to his superiors afterward. His men had the numbers. They had the position. They had the momentum of a battle they were winning. And they gave ground anyway, because there is something profoundly unnerving about an enemy who attacks into your strength for a reason you cannot understand. A man will stand against another man who is trying to kill him. It is much harder to stand against a man who does not seem to care whether he dies, as long as he reaches the body in front of him first. Thon's soldiers did not know what they were looking at. They only knew it was coming at them, and it would not stop. And for a few minutes, on that slope, the men who were winning ran from the men who were losing. Thon saw one of the Americans clearly for just a moment in the light of a flare. A single rifleman hunched low, moving down into the guns with a kind of terrible purpose. Not firing, not shouting, just going. Reaching a fallen shape in the grass, getting a fistful of the man's harness, and starting to drag him back up the hill, through fire that should have killed them both twice over. There was nothing heroic in the way it looked. It looked like a man doing hard physical labor, under impossible conditions, grim and single-minded, as if the bullets were just bad weather he had decided to work through. That image stayed with Thon longer than any other from that night. Not a soldier charging gloriously into battle. A young man dragging his friend out of the dark, refusing to notice that he was supposed to be dead. The Americans got their wounded. They dragged them back up the hill, under fire, and they got back into their holes. And the line held. By dawn, the relief that Thon had counted on never arriving had begun to arrive after all. Helicopters and the fire they brought. The moment had passed. But Thon carried something down off that ridge that he had not carried up it. A crack, small but real, in the picture he had trusted for 2 years. He had just watched soft men do a hard thing that his hard men would not do, and he needed to know why. After that night, Thon began to pay a different kind of attention. He had always studied the Americans as a problem of firepower and position. Now he began to study them as men, and the more he watched, the more he saw that the thing on the hilltop had not been a freak. It was a pattern. It showed up in different forms, in fight after fight, wherever American riflemen were pushed to the edge. He saw it in ambushes and at fire bases, and on lonely patrols caught in the open, in every kind of fight where his picture said the Americans should fall. Some of them did the opposite, not all, but enough. Always enough to ruin the plan. One of those fights he came to know in detail because he questioned a man who had lived through it. It had been an ambush on a mountain track, a good ambush, well laid, that should have destroyed the American patrol in the first 30 seconds. Most ambushes that go right end with the survivors running, and the running is where the rest of them die. This patrol did not run. A young rifleman with a bandaged arm described it to Thon through an interpreter, and what he described made no military sense. When the guns opened up, the American said the men had turned and gone straight at them. Uphill, into the fire. Thon asked him why. Why not go to ground? Why not fall back? Why attack a prepared position with no artillery and no support? The young American looked at him as though the question were strange. Because that was where the shooting was coming from, he said. Because the longer you lay in the kill zone, the more of your friends died in it. The fastest way out of an ambush, he said, was straight through the people who set it. Thon had never heard it put that way. It was reckless. It was also, he realized slowly, correct. A man in a kill zone who runs gives the enemy his back and dies tired. A man who charges gives the enemy a problem they did not plan for. It worked, and it was precisely the last thing a man who wanted to live was supposed to do. He saw the same thing at a firebase his regiment hit a few weeks later. The plan was sound. Breach the wire in the dark, pour men through the gap, and the defenders would pull back to the center, the way defenders do, giving up the perimeter to save themselves. Instead, the Americans nearest the breach ran toward it. They counterattacked into the gap while it was still full of Thon's soldiers, and they closed it with grenades and rifles at a range of a few meters, and they held it closed with their bodies. The men who sealed that breach had to know what it would cost them. Most of them paid it. The breach held shut anyway, because behind each man who fell, there was another one moving up to take his place at the gap, and none of them would be the one who let it open. He began to ask the question that mattered. Not what were they doing. He could see what they were doing. Why? Why would a man who loved his life, who was counting the days until he went home, throw himself at a machine gun for a corpse? Fanaticism was the easy answer, and Thon, to his credit, did not accept it. He had seen fanatics. He had commanded some. Fanatics fight for an idea, for a leader, for a god or a nation, with their eyes lifted up and away from the ground. These Americans were not looking up at anything. Whatever drove them was not above them. It was right in front of them on the ground, in the mud, and it had a face and a name. Slowly, from prisoners and from watching and from the hard evidence of the battlefield, Thon assembled the answer. It was not the flag. Ask a captured American why he fought, and he would rarely say his country, and almost never say the war itself, which many of them did not believe in. He fought for the men around him. That was the whole of it, and it was larger than it sounds. The American Army had done something, by accident or design, that Thon's picture had entirely missed. It had bound its riflemen to each other in small groups so tightly that the group became the thing they would not lose. Not their lives, each other. A man would risk his life without hesitation, would spend it freely, to keep from losing the man beside him, because losing that man was, to him, worse than dying. This was the piece Thon's picture had gotten exactly backward. He had assumed the American's love of life made him easy to break, because a man who wants to live will not fight to the death. But the Americans did not love their own lives more than everything. They loved the men beside them more than their own lives. And an army built on that foundation does not break the way a normal army breaks. You can kill its leaders and the men keep fighting for each other. You can surround it and the men fight harder, because now the only thing left to protect is the one thing they will never abandon. You can convince a man his position is hopeless, and it does not make him surrender, because he is not fighting for the position. He is fighting for the wounded man 10 meters in front of him, and that man is not hopeless yet. It was, Thon came to see, the most durable kind of loyalty there is, precisely because it was so small. His own army asked its men to love enormous things: the nation, the revolution, the reunification of a country most of them would never see whole. Those were powerful reasons, and men died for them by the hundreds of thousands. But an enormous cause is also an abstract one, and abstractions can waver in the dark when the shooting starts. The American had been given something much smaller and much harder to shake. He did not have to believe in anything larger than the man he could reach out and touch. And you cannot argue a man out of that. You cannot bomb it or surround it or outlast it. It does not depend on the war going well, or on believing the cause is just, or on anything at all except the presence of the men beside him. It was the smallest possible reason to fight. It turned out to be the strongest. Here is the part the phrase gets wrong. Because on the American side of that hilltop, there was no such thing as a man with nothing to lose. There were men with almost everything to lose, and they were fighting like it. Ray Doyle, the corporal from the coal town, did not feel reckless when he went down that slope. He would have told you, if you had asked him, that going down that slope was the most careful thing he did all night. Because up on that hill was a kid named Sullivan, and Sullivan was his. Doyle and Sullivan had come up through the same replacement pipeline 8 months earlier, two scared teenagers who did not know a rifle from a shovel. They had been afraid together in the same holes ever since. Sullivan was from a farm town in Ohio and could not stop talking, and Doyle was from a coal town in West Virginia and could not start, and somehow that had made them inseparable. They had split every package from home. They had covered for each other's watches. Doyle knew the name of Sullivan's girl and the sound of his snoring and the exact face he made before he was about to say something stupid. 8 months in that place had made them closer than most brothers get in a lifetime. That is what the war did to men who survived it together. It welded them. So it was not his brother by blood. It was his brother by the thing that happens to men who are afraid together for long enough. And when Sullivan was hit and rolled down the forward slope, out into the dark, alive, and calling, the arithmetic that said, leave him, was not arithmetic at all to Doyle. It was a betrayal too large to survive. He would rather die on that slope than live the rest of his life as the man who had left Sullivan calling in the dark. He did not weigh it. There was nothing to weigh. He went, that is the thing the enemy misread as having nothing to lose. It was the opposite. It was a man who had found in the worst place on earth something he valued more than his own life, and who was not willing to lose it no matter what it cost. The recklessness Thon saw was not the recklessness of a man who did not care. It was the terrible focus of a man who cared about one thing so much that everything else, including his own survival, had gone quiet. Fear does not disappear in a man like that. It gets outweighed. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. And it was built on purpose, even if the men who built it did not fully know what they were building. The American way of making soldiers did not produce fanatics who loved the war. It could not. Too many of them had been dragged into it against their will, so it made something else. It took frightened strangers and it welded them in training and in fear and in shared misery into small families that would not quit on each other. It started in training, where they were broken down and rebuilt as a group, taught that the man on your left and the man on your right were your responsibility and you were theirs. But training only planted it. The war grew it into something training never could have. You cannot manufacture on a parade ground what happens between men who have been terrified together in the same hole through the same long night, who have shared the same last cigarette and the same bad water and the same certainty that they were going to die before morning. The squad, the fire team, the handful of men who learned each other's fears in the dark and carried them without ever being asked. By the time a rifleman had been in country a few months, the abstract idea of his country had gone very far away, and the 6 or 8 men around him had become the entire world. A man might not die for a flag he could no longer quite see the point of. He would die without a second thought for the man who had shared his last cigarette. And the Army, whether it planned it or not, had made an infantry out of exactly those bonds. So when Thon's picture told him that cutting off the Americans' firepower would leave him just a man, the picture was right, and it did not matter at all, because the man it left was not the weak part. The man was the whole point. Strip away the helicopters and the artillery and the endless supply, and what remained was a rifleman who would come down a slope into a machine gun to bring back a friend. That was not the soft underbelly of the American Army. That was its hardest bone. And Thon had spent 2 years aiming at exactly the wrong place. The night that finally taught Thon the full lesson came almost a year later, and it cost him more than any battle of his life. He had learned enough by then to respect the thing he was fighting. He had not yet learned that respecting it was not the same as being able to beat it. His regiment caught an American company in a bad place, a shallow bowl of ground with high sides at the end of a long day's march, low on water and far from support. It was the kind of position that gets men killed, and Thon knew it the moment he saw it. He had the high ground on three sides. He had the numbers badly in his favor. He had learned from the hilltop, and this time he did not expect the Americans to break. He expected them to fight, and to fight hard, and he planned for it. He would not squeeze them slowly. He would hit them all at once from three sides with everything and overwhelm them before their loyalty to each other could organize itself into a defense. The assault went in at last light, and for the first few minutes it worked the way Thon intended. His men poured down off the high ground into the bowl. The American line buckled. Their command post was overrun in the first rush. Their mortars were taken. It was, for those first minutes, the battle Thon had spent a year learning how to fight. He had absorbed every lesson the hilltop and the ambushes and the fire bases had taught him, and he had built an assault designed to move faster than American cohesion could organize. Speed was the answer, he had decided. If these men drew their terrible strength from each other, then the way to beat them was to break them apart and finish them before they could reach one another in the dark. So he hit them everywhere at once, hard, and for a quarter of an hour it seemed he had finally found the method. The Americans were coming apart. Their organized resistance was collapsing. By the clock and the map, Thon was winning the fight he had come to win. By any measure, Thon understood the company should have been finished in that first violent quarter of an hour, and part of it was. He had done everything right. He had learned his lesson. He had planned for men who would not quit, and he had brought enough force to break them anyway. Then the thing he could still not fully account for happened one more time, and on a scale he had never seen. The company did not have a line anymore. It did not have a command post or a plan. What it had was 40 or 50 separate small fights, each one a handful of riflemen back to back, and not one of those little knots of men would break, because breaking meant leaving the others. There was no center left to collapse. Thon had aimed to shatter their cohesion, and instead he had shattered them into 100 pieces, and every single piece kept fighting. You cannot rout an army that has already been broken into individual men who have each decided not to run. There is nothing left to rout. Thon's soldiers, pouring into the bowl, expected to find a beaten enemy and to finish him. What they found instead was a nightmare with no shape to it. There was no line to roll up, no headquarters to seize, no signal that would tell the Americans they had lost. Every hole held men who fought as if the whole battle depended on that one hole. His soldiers would clear a position and take fire from three others. They would push into a gap and find two riflemen in it who would not yield it, and behind those two, when they fell, two more. The attack that was supposed to sweep through the bowl instead sank into it and began, position by position, to bleed. And then in the dark, in the chaos of a place that was supposedly overrun, the Americans began to counterattack. Not on order. There was no one left to give the order. Small groups on their own started moving toward the sound of their own wounded and toward each other. And in doing so, they began to knit the 100 little fights back into something whole. Ray Doyle was there, older now, a sergeant, and he did what he had done on the hilltop a year before. And what he would have said was simply the only thing a person could do. He gathered the men near him. He went toward the men who were not near him. He crawled from hole to hole in the dark, under fire from his own overrun perimeter, pulling knots of frightened men together into bigger knots, pointing them outward, giving them the one thing a soldier in that chaos needs more than ammunition, the knowledge that he is not alone, that the man beside him is still there and still fighting. That was all it took. All over that bowl, other men were doing the same, each of them refusing to be the last one standing, because none of them would leave the others to stand last. The company reassembled itself in the dark, under fire, out of nothing but the refusal of its men to leave each other, and it drove Thon's regiment back up the sides of the bowl it had just come down. By the time the flares and the gunships and the artillery arrived, The worst was already over, and the Americans had done the worst of it themselves, with rifles and grenades and their bare refusal to be finished. Thon pulled back what was left of his regiment, and it was not much. He had brought everything he had learned and every advantage the ground could give him, and it had not been enough, because the thing he was fighting did not have a breaking point in the place where breaking points are supposed to be. He had spent his best regiment trying to kill a company that would not die, for the simplest and most unbreakable of reasons. The men in it would not leave each other, and you cannot kill that with numbers. Thon had finally, fully learned it. It had cost him everything to learn. In the gray morning after, Thon walked the edge of that bowl and looked down at what the night had cost. His dead lay thick on the slopes his men had charged down so confidently at last light. Among them, here and there, lay Americans, the ones who had held the little knots of resistance that would not break, who had bought the survival of the rest with their own lives. Thon had seen many battlefields, and this one taught him something the others had not. The Americans had not won because they were stronger or better armed or more willing to die than his own men. They had won because at the moment everything came apart. Not one of them had been willing to be the man who left. That was the whole of it. That was the thing he had never been able to plan around and now knew he never would. Thon survived the war. Many of the men who taught him this lesson did not assault, and neither did most of the men he sent to learn it. He grew old in a country at peace, an old soldier with a hard face and a long memory. And of all the things he had seen in all his years of fighting, the American rifleman at the edge of destruction was the one he came back to most. He did not remember the Americans he had fought with hatred. That surprised the people he spoke to about it late in his life. He had every reason for hatred. They had killed his friends and ruined his plans and outlasted his cause. But what he felt looking back was closer to the respect one craftsman feels for another who has beaten him at his own trade. He had spent years trying to find the place where the American soldier would break, and in the end he had decided that for the best of them, in the moments that mattered most, there was no such place, not because they were more than human, because of what they were willing to be human for. He said more than once that his own side had misunderstood the Americans, and that the misunderstanding had cost lives. His army had told its soldiers that the Americans were soft, that they fought only for money and machines, that they had no stomach for a real fight up close. And that propaganda had gotten men killed because it sent them into close fights expecting the enemy to fold, and the enemy did not fold. Thon had learned the hard way that the most dangerous American was not the one calling in the airstrike from a mile away. It was the one who had run out of airstrikes and run out of options and had nothing left but a rifle and the man beside him. That American would do things that no amount of firepower could have prepared you for. The strangest part to Thon's was that the Americans themselves never seemed to know they were remarkable. He had interrogated enough of them to notice it. Ask a captured American rifleman about the thing he had done, the charge into the guns, the refusal to leave the wounded, and he would look at you as though the question made no sense. There was one in particular Thon never forgot. A prisoner, young, wounded, exhausted, who had been pulled out of a fight where he had stayed behind with 2 injured men to hold off a much larger force so the rest of his squad could get clear. It was the kind of act that earned a medal in any army, the kind of thing that got a man remembered. Thon, through the interpreter, asked him whether he had known he would probably die doing it. The American thought about it and said yes, he had figured he probably would. Then why, Thon asked, did you do it? And the young man seemed genuinely confused by the question. He said they were his guys. He said it the way another man might explain that water is wet, not as a decision he had made, but as a fact about the world that required no defending. They were his guys. That was the beginning and the end of it. He did not think he had done anything unusual. He had stayed with his guys. What else was there to do? That was the answer every time, and it was the answer that finally made Than understand. The thing that made these men so hard to kill was not something they reached for in the crisis. It was so deep in them that they did not even see it. It was just who they were, standing next to the men they would not leave. Here is what the enemy finally understood about the American riflemen who seemed to fight with nothing to lose. It was the most complete misreading of the war, and correcting it took some of them the whole war to do. An army that fears for its own life can be beaten by threatening that life. This is the oldest logic of war. Surround the enemy, cut off his escape, make the cost of fighting higher than the cost of surrender, and a rational enemy surrenders. It works because it is built on a true thing about human beings, that we want to live. The North Vietnamese logic was sound, and against most enemies, in most times, it would have worked. It broke against the American rifleman for one reason. He wanted something more than he wanted to live, and that something was not an idea or a flag or a fear. It was the man next to him. That is why the threat did not work. You cannot make surrender cheaper than fighting for a man who is not fighting to save himself in the first place. Take away his firepower, and you have not disarmed him. You have only removed the last thing standing between him and the enemy, and now there is nothing left to do but close the distance. Surround him, and you have not trapped him. You have simply made it so that the only thing left to protect is the one thing he will die before abandoning. Every lever the enemy pulled to break him was a lever built for a man who loved his own life most, and that was never the man they were fighting. So they called it fighting like they had nothing to lose, because from the outside, that is exactly what it looked like. Men throwing themselves at death, as though death did not matter. But they had it perfectly backward, and the truth was the harder and better thing. Those men did not have nothing to lose. They had everything to lose, and it was not their own lives. It was each other. It was lying wounded in the mud 10 meters in front of them, and it was standing back to back in the dark beside them, and it was worth more to them than living. That is not the courage of men who have given up. It is the courage of men who have found the one thing they will not. There is an image that could stand for the whole of it, though no camera ever caught it, the one Thon carried out of that first night and kept for the rest of his life. A young man, head down in the flare light, dragging his friend up a hill through fire that should have killed them both, too intent on the weight of the other man to notice he was supposed to be dead. There was nothing in it of the glory the recruiting posters promise. It was just labor and love and refusal. Multiply that one man by 100,000, across 100 hills and 1,000 nights, and you have the thing the enemy spent an entire war failing to solve. That was the part that unsettled Thong most in the end, that they were not giants. If they had been supermen, he could have made sense of it, because supermen are supposed to do impossible things. These were the same tired, homesick, unwilling young men his propaganda had described. And they did the impossible anyway, not because they were more than human, but because each of them had found, in the worst place on earth, one small thing he had decided was worth more than his own life. You could kill any one of them. The enemy killed a great many, and it changed nothing, because you could not make the ones who were left let go. They were not the strongest army, man for man, or the most fanatical, or the most willing to die for a cause. They were homesick young men who did not want to be there, and who fought like lions anyway, for the plainest reason there is. Their enemy spent years trying to find the place where they would break. In the end, the best of them broke a regiment instead, not because they had nothing to lose, but because they had everything to lose, and it was standing right beside them. That was the thing the enemy could never plan for, and never quite kill. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping. Not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, impossible things ordinary men did for each other in the worst places on earth, on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you're watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, in any unit, on any side. Tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.